Well, hello, and welcome along to another We Happy Few 506 podcast, The Nearly Men, with myself and the beautiful Doug Allen. How you doing, Dougie?
I'm very well, thank you, Matt. How are you?
Not too bad at all, thank you, considering, all things considering.
How is
Um,
young Rigby?
young Rigby is good. He's a good young baby. Um, yeah. He's sucking the life out of me. No, it's beautiful. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to have a new baby.
Yeah.
Um, and I will stand by that. So this evening's podcast is a bit of a special podcast because we have a historian on who is a historical advisor on the third installment of the Band of Brothers trilogy, Masters of the Air. So could I welcome to the podcast Matt Mabe? How you doing, Matt?
I'm great. How are you guys?
Cool. I definitely pronounced your second name correctly there, did I?
You did.
Yes, score each. Look at that. Fantastic.
Excellent.
Okay,
Welcome, Matt.
so we Leighton and I have been chatting a lot recently with Kirk Sadusky, who you know, um, and he will not let a thing slip about Masters of the Air, and I don't expect you to either. But you could tell me with your eyes, has it been fantastic to work on? Okay, we're going to talk about the 100th Bomb Group,
Sure.
um, and I'd like, if I could, we'll start broad and we'll go in deeper because if we could do one thing with this podcast, which would be awesome for me as a fan and as a nerd and as a historian, and I think for our listeners as well, is to start a little wider and then get down to what we call on this podcast the grunt's eye view. Because as far as I can tell, quite a lot of the time with stuff about bombers and bomber command, British bomber command and stuff, it's very broad, especially what you read about and see about in films. It's big formations, it's large bombing raids, and it would be very cool for us to learn what it was like as an airman on one of those B-17s, the day-to-day stuff, what they went through. And I'll drill down deeper into that a bit later, but for now let's go back and start broad. So tell us about the 100th Bomb Group.
Sure. From just a kind of broad strokes perspective. So, like many groups in World War II, it started on paper back in 1942. Back in the fall of 42 is when the first actual cadre of initial guys were assigned to the 100th. At that time, they were at Gowan Field, Idaho, so out in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
But they didn't actually get their first set of planes from Boeing until November. That's when the first four crews were assigned to the 100th with the first four airplanes. So at that point, you had four squadrons. You had the 349th, 350th, 351st, and the 418th. So most of that initial time here stateside in 42 was involving training, everything from the basics of flying B-17s, flying formation to gunnery training. You also, with planes, you can't do anything without the ground crews. So the ground crews were learning their job, and they were learning about the crews that they would support. So that was a vital relationship in itself. But all of this was, much like when we're dealing with topics like the airborne, it's a untested. It's untested in the sense that it's never been done before. So they're learning as they go to some extent and preparing for what they think will come based on what they've been told and what they understand. But much of that early time is training. That they get additional crews as the months go on, but it's an interesting period in time. Many of those guys never necessarily set out to be bomber pilots. A lot of those guys thought they were going to be hotshot pilots flying single engine fighters. Come to find out they're being sent to a bomber outfit. So for some, it was I'd say unusual arrangement, but for others, they welcomed the opportunity. They had no idea what was in store, but a lot of these guys will tell you today the B-17 is the best airplane they've ever flown, and they wouldn't trade it for anything else. So that's kind of the early period.
Yeah, sorry, can I interject there? Sorry, Matt. Sorry. Yeah, because you spoke about the airborne, and then and we on this podcast are huge fans of SAS Rogue Heroes as well. And there's that sort of like early period where they're just sort of improvising with what they have, jumping out of a hole at the bottom of a hot air balloon or stuff like that. Is there examples of that in the early days where they just, I mean, they don't have the equipment, so what are they training with?
So, I mean, they did have B-17s. It was very early model B-17s. The B-17s that they trained in stateside, some of those were phased out by the several months afterwards. Those are B-17E models, the very early models that the U.S. Army Air Forces was using back at that time. So you could train on the B-17, but I guess, for instance, one kind of vignette that shows you how it's kind of improvised as you go is how do you train in formation flying and high altitude flying? So one of the, I guess, first kind of snafus that the 100th ran into was in April 43 when they're still stateside. They're told that you're going to fly a high altitude mission. All 21 planes are going to be flying from Kearney, Nebraska to Hamilton Field in California, which sounds like a easy 1,300-mile trip, but it goes haywire almost immediately. 3 of the planes land in Las Vegas, including the plane flown by the CO, which doesn't help. And to top things off, another plane flies east and lands in Tennessee. So that event in itself got their original CO, a guy named Colonel Dar Alkire, got him sacked. So they weren't starting off on very sure footing at the onset of the 100th, back when they were stateside in early 43.
And when did they come to Europe?
They came to Europe. The original, the ground crews sailed overseas. They actually, went by boat overseas in May of 43, and then the air crews actually flew their B-17s. It took multiple stops, Labrador, Greenland, multiple hops to get over to Europe. But it was a long trip, a perilous trip, I suppose. But that's when they first made it to England. Their original base was slated to be a place called Poddington. So the 100th was there for just a very short period before they transited over to Thorpe Abbotts, which became their permanent home for the war duration.
And when was that?
So that was in early summer of 1943. So it's interesting, when they arrive at Thorpe Abbotts in June, the base is still being finished. They're still putting down asphalt for runways, building some of the Nissen huts. They're arriving at a place that is not quite ready for them. But that's East Anglia was farm country at that time, and these bases were being built out of thin air, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't think it's much better now, to be honest with you. So how long before they're sort of operational? When did they start getting involved in the bombing campaigns?
Sure. So it's interesting. The very first person that flew combat missions from the 100th was Major John Egan, who you may have heard of from Don Miller's book, Masters of the Air. Just a very well-known figure in 8th Air Force history. But Egan originally started out as the operations officer and then became one of the squadron COs in the 100th. But Egan actually flew 2 missions with the 305th Bomb Group. And so he was the first person that had a taste of what combat would be like, which I obviously never had a chance to chat with Egan, but I'm sure he probably conveyed to the men, what they had in store. He was the first guy that saw it firsthand and could tell them, here's what we've trained for, but here's what it's really like.
Right.
But the 100th itself flew its first combat mission on June 25th of 1943. And I think they probably didn't expect what was in store for them on that first mission. It was to attack U-boat pins. So a pretty quick hop across the English Channel and back to East Anglia. But, as a difficult awakening to bombing missions, they lost 3 crews. So 30 guys didn't make it back home just on that first mission alone. So you can imagine what a shock that was for the guys, and how they just took an instant morale hit that you lose guys on your very first mission.
Was that a daylight? Was that a daylight mission? Were they all pretty much daylight? Those
That was so the 100th. So the 8th Air Force bombed in daylight, and as you probably heard from just the combined air offensive, British bombed at night, Americans bombed at day. Just the round the clock bombing effort. But for all intents and purposes, all the 100th missions were daylight bombing raids.
And the attack on the U-boat pen, is that Roscoff, or it's around that area north?
So that one was Bremen.
Bremen, okay.
The very first one was so in northern Germany. So most of the early targets were right over the lines in terms of the German border.
And so conversely, you'd think that would be possibly safer than the sort of the deep stuff into Germany. But were the German defenses and the German fighter defenses stronger at that time?
So it's interesting for when the guys are in the operations briefing and looking at the board when they pull the curtain back to see where they're bombing that day. If it's a short hop, guys might infer it to be an easy one, or what they call a milk run of we're going to be there and back. So especially some of the ones that were on the northern coast of France, the guys thought hey, that's just a couple hours. We're going to hit the coast of France, hit the target, and we're going to come right back. But sometimes those prove to be the most dangerous because at that time, German fighter attacks were just fierce, and you were not only contending with that, but with German anti-aircraft guns, which was very unpredictable.
Right.
So was the type of men that would join an air crew, were they kind of similar in men to join the airborne? Like you get these incredibly force of nature characters that were doing something that would never been done before, were they like sort of pioneers? But was there a similar kind of mentality amongst the crews? They all thought they were the best and trained the best, and in these, which must have been back then, incredibly advanced machines.
I think you get a little bit of that. It's interesting from all the guys I've talked to, aviation is nothing new for us these days, but back then it was, cutting edge stuff. So you had a lot of guys that said, I knew from the get-go I wanted to be a pilot, or enlisted men that figured, I'd rather do that than go into the infantry. I'm going to volunteer for the it was originally the Army Air Corps, and then it became the U.S. Army Air Forces. But I think one thing that's pretty fascinating is you had guys from all walks of life. One of the more interesting pilots I find from the 100th is a guy named John Brady. He was part of the original cadre. Brady was a musician. He was teaching school up in upstate New York as a musician, but just had a passion for aviation and became a pretty skilled pilot. So you had a little bit of everybody. But I think you're two of your more well-known guys. I mentioned John Egan, but also Gale, Buck, Clevin. These guys both knew from the get-go they wanted to be pilots. They fit the bill for being your hotshot pilots, but it wasn't just all talk for them. They could walk the walk. They were fantastic pilots and fantastic aircraft commanders.
Because in some of the airborne guys said that one of the reasons that some of them joined was the fact they got danger money, because you got more money than just an infantryman. I'm guessing an aircrew and a bomber would have got a kind of danger money as well. Would they have done over other forms of sort of air warfare, or rather than flying a C-130 or something, or a transport plane or something? I don't know.
You got flight pay, so that certainly sweetened the pot a little bit.
Yeah. Interesting.
Were there examples of guys that had been really decent pilots in civilian life that had come across?
I struggle to think of guys who were pilots in civilian life, just because aviation was in its infancy back then. And a lot of these guys were very, very young pilots. I mean, in the case of Egan and Clevin, both of them actually enlisted before the Pearl Harbor attack. So those guys were in early on. They had not been commercial pilots, but both had trained in the very early days of it. But one interesting story about someone who had been in aviation before: the main engineering officer of the 100th was a guy named Eugene Ravino, better known as Butch. Butch was a Marine Corps pilot during World War I, flying biplanes back then. And he had no reason to be serving in World War II, having served in World War I, but he was just one of these patriotic, passionate guys. Butch actually wrote to the War Department and said, I was a pilot in World War I. Aviation is still something that's going to be important in this war. I think I have something to offer and volunteer my services. So sure enough, he enlisted and became the engineering officer for the 100th, which was basically in charge of the maintenance for all the planes. And he was just kind of a father figure for all these ground crews.
That's a great story. Thanks for that. And then so before we get more into the drill down, nitty gritty grunt size stuff, who in the 100th Bomb Group would you consider to be the sort of the talismanic figure? If we just keep leaping back over to our story, the Band of Brothers story, and the Dick Winter stuff, and the Eugene Sledge stuff in the Pacific and others, who is the sort of 100th Bomb Group talisman?
So I think they have a few, in part because you had guys that were shot down and lost, and you had other leaders step up in their place. But I think there's a few in terms of the air crews. You had Egan and Clevin. If you've ever read Harry Crosby's book, Wing and a Prayer, it's not only a fantastic World War II memoir, probably one of the best, but it's one of the very few that really gives you an idea of what happened to the air crews. And Crosby talks about how much the guys just admired Egan and Clevin. They had their, hat cocked to the side. I think, as Harry said, they, quote, spoke like Hollywood. And they were like characters out of the movie I Wanted Wings. But like I said, they weren't just characters. They were guys that were great at their job and just inspired the men. And I think people knew that if Clevin is flying this mission and if he's confident, things are going to be all right. They were guys like that. But both were ultimately shot down in the fall of 43. So you had other guys come in that filled that void. Guys like Robert Rosie Rosenthal, who became kind of the inspirational leader of the 100th, one of the most decorated airmen in World War II, but just a different personality. He didn't have the cocky appearance that Clevin and Egan had. Rosie was your quiet professional, but he was the guy that led by example, the guy that said, follow me. And the guys knew that, if Rosie is going and if he's saying it's going to be all right, this is a guy to follow. But the 100th also had some interesting COs over their time. One of the guys that was very influential was a guy named Tom Jeffrey. Tom came in 44 when, after they had lost so many crews, and Jeffrey worked on things like formation flying, how do we ensure that we're losing less guys? And the men just really came to respect Tom Jeffrey. But there's a number, but I think those are some that come to mind. And some of those are names that Don Miller features in Masters of the Air as well.
Sorry, you'll see me scribbling notes when you speak. I'm like, this is like a little lecture here.
That's the good thing about Don Miller's book. It gives you, it gives you kind of a preview of what you can imagine might be forthcoming in this series.
Good. One of the couple of things actually jumped out when you were talking just then. And I was going to speak about it later. Well, two things. One was about formation flying, which if we could speak about that a bit later on, that would be great. Please remind me about that, Dougie, if I don't come back to that. Yeah. The other is that, so you've got this, very cool, cocky, hat on the side wearing, good looking American bomber pilot in England. How was he received by the locals?
It's interesting. You've probably heard the phrase of the Americans being overpaid, oversexed, and over here. There's certainly some truth to that. But I think what's interesting is East Anglia at that time, which is in the eastern part of England. I mean, that's a very rural area. It's like going back in time to some extent. And suddenly from overnight, you went from little farming communities to having an air base practically. I think the number is, every 8 miles, there's an airfield. So what's interesting is these guys really were embraced by the locals, both from, the adults, but from the kids that live nearby that would come around to the base. And, whether they're going on a pass going into England or just at the local pub, I think there's a great deal of admiration from the British towards the Americans, knowing that, things were not good at that point in the war. And certainly not that the Americans, saved the day on their own, but having them join the fight with the British was of vital importance. And so there's I think a great deal of respect going both ways from the Americans and the British.
Certainly helped a bit. Yeah. So there's that. It was, you mentioned it before. They were bringing a bit of Hollywood. I can just imagine it suddenly feeling like in a Hollywood movie. If you're in some tiny little village that you've barely left in East Anglia, your dad works a farm, and suddenly these Hollywood-looking Americans show up looking so cool with their aviators and leather jackets. It must have just been amazing.
I think that's certainly the case. I think there have been a number of interviews with some of the young kids that visited the base over the years, and they talk about, some of these airmen were like father figures to them because their dads were off deployed elsewhere, maybe in Burma or somewhere else with the British military. So the air crews and the ground crews were, very kind, and it gave them a sense of home as well. They were, some of these guys were married and had kids back home. So to have a special relationship with the British people around Thorpe Abbotts. It was very, very meaningful to them. One story I'll share with you on that. There's a gentleman I've met named John Grout who's still with us. John grew up in Harrelson, which is not far from Thorpe Abbotts, but John's dad was killed in the British Navy in the early part of the war. So he would come over to base and, they'd give him chocolates and things that they got from the PX. And he just had such an admiration for these guys. And he came back to the base, which is now a museum, many times over the years. And that's just one of many stories. There's just, such a deep admiration for these guys who, really looked up to the Americans that were suddenly in their neighborhood.
My dad remembers them because in the edge of East London, you had a North Weald airfield, which was Hurricanes, but just about 5, 6, 7, 8 miles down the road, further in Essex, you had a B17 squadron. I don't know who they were, but there were American squadrons in Essex as well, and all the way, which is just outside of London, just going northeast, and then if you keep going, you get into Suffolk and Norfolk, and if you go to almost any country pub around there, you will see a picture of B-17s, because there were so many bases there, like you were saying earlier. There were bases littered all over, all the way up that coast. And my old man remembers seeing what he thought what must have been like bomber crews or American pilots, and used to get cigarettes for them and stuff like that. And so he could keep the cards out the cigarette packets, which all had kind of war heroes and stuff on them. Yeah, my dad remembers that.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. A lot of these bases, you'd have families that would do the airmen's laundry, and bring it back to them and give them some things from the PX that, they couldn't get on the market otherwise. So it's pretty neat.
But we should probably get more gritty and talk about the reality of what the 100th Bomb Group went through. And they quite quickly earned the moniker the Bloody Hundredth, didn't they?
They did. I think that was kind of forged during 1943, during a period where the losses across the 8th Air Force were just so staggering.
And that might be where we bring in the formation flying as well. Was that due to the formations that they were flying? Was it due to sort of early tactics, or was it just due to the German strength at that time?
So I think the original thought was that, heavily armed B-17s flying in tight formations could withstand attacks from German aircraft, which in some instances that's the case, but it just didn't match with reality in how it played out. But I think there's a couple factors. One of which was, at that point in the war, you didn't have fighter air escort in the same way you did during 44 and 45. So the P-47s, for instance, could take them across the channel right up to enemy territory and have to turn back. And the Germans quickly learned that. So, the Luftwaffe wouldn't waste precious fuel and resources during that period. They'd wait for them to come into their territory and then pounce. So at that point in the war, the fighter attacks were just staggering. It took a heavy toll on the men. And it is just very difficult I've talked to some of these gunners about, what it's like trying to shoot down enemy aircraft. And, when you watch it in a movie or something, it seems like you can, follow them and have a few seconds, but so much of that happens in a split second. It's just, as one guy said, sometimes it just comes down to pure luck. But the lack of fighter escort is really, I think, the biggest piece of why they took such a heavy toll during that point in 1943.
And when did they get fighter escort? When did that change?
So in 44 is when it really started to change, when the P-51 became much more readily available. They added drop tanks to the P-51 to the point where the P-51 could take them all the way to the target and back. And there's some other things too that impacted the overall approach of not just formation flying, but originally the intent was escort fighters would stay with the planes and go with them all the way, just, a protection force. But in 44, for instance, when Jimmy Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force, Doolittle was a pioneering airman in his own right. Doolittle changed the policy on that. He said, the point of of fighters, it shouldn't be just to protect the bombers. It's to go after the Luftwaffe, whether they're in the air or on the ground. So he sicked these guys loose on the Luftwaffe of, if it flies, we're going to shoot it down. So there was a much more aggressive posture at that point in terms of going after the Germans. And eventually, as the war went on, the Germans just could not replace the pilots they'd lost, which is certainly one reason why the loss rate improved.
Also, I'd be remiss, as my father-in-law worked for Rolls-Royce for many, many years, not to mention the Rolls-Royce engine in the P-51, the Merlin.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That, I think anyone who's a P-51 expert will tell you that's probably one of the most important aspects of why the P-51 became such a successful fighter.
Wonderful. So we'll bring it down even further and talk about the B-17 and the crew. So what is a B-17 for our listeners who may be kind of flying blind here, to use a terrible pun? What does a B-17 crew consist of?
Sure. A B-17 in itself is considered a heavy bomber. They kind of classify them as light bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers. So a heavy would be a B-17 or a B-24. At the early part of the war, you had a 10-man crew. You had a gunner in the tail, you had waist gunners, you had a radio operator who also had a gun, you had a ball turret gunner, which is not necessarily a position many men want to take. You had a guy who was a top turret gunner that was also an engineer, so he was looking after the maintenance on board the aircraft. Then if you look at kind of the front section of the plane, up in the cockpit, you have the pilot and co-pilot. But there in the nose, you have the navigator and the bombardier who both had access to guns. So early in the war, it was a 10-man crew. Eventually, it was whittled down to a 9-man crew once it was determined that German fighter attacks weren't posing the same threat that they did early in the war. But that's kind of your the nucleus of that crew.
And which was the gun position that got cold? Then we went from 10 to a 9. Which position got relinquished?
So what? Two things interestingly enough were at that point the radio operator no longer. There was a gun that was on top of the plane that had a very limited range of fire that the radio operator manned. That was no longer necessary later in the war, so the radio operator manned his desk. But they pulled one of the waist gunners. So the thought was, if we get into a hairy situation where we need 2 gunners, the radio operator will leave his post and go assist one of the waist gunners.
And so what does a day look like for this crew if they know they're going on a mission?
Sure. So actually, that's one of the interesting things. I think a lot of the time you didn't know if you're going on a mission, and I think that added to the anxiety and stress of what was going to happen. So if you picture yourself back in 43, for instance, it's evening, you're in the barracks. At each squadron area at the orderly room building, there were lights that showed whether there was going to be a mission. If it was green, it's a go. If it's red, no go. And if it's yellow, that meant there was a pending standby. Some guys told me, best case scenario, I would prefer to go to bed knowing that I have a mission tomorrow. Just get the news out there so I can, mentally prepare myself. But a lot of times you didn't know. You might be awoken at 2:30 in the morning by the orderly who comes in with his flashlight and says, this crew, you're flying today. Get ready. But to kind of give you like a quick timeline of what that would look like. So most of the guys told me, you if you were going to shower at base, you do it the night before. You don't have time to. It's like a fire alarm at a firehouse. You don't have time to do all this stuff in the morning. So after the orderly woke them up at 2:30, 3 a.m., head over to the latrines, throw some water on your face. These guys also made sure in advance that they were clean shaven, because if you have a mask on, you don't want it chafing on your face. So that was always something they were cognizant of. But you had enough time to hit the latrine, throw water on your face, and then by that time they head over to breakfast. One luxury of breakfast, I suppose, is you got fresh eggs if you were flying a mission that day. But a lot of the guys will tell you, they, despite the fact that you got fresh eggs and better breakfast on those days, your nerves would get to you. At best, maybe you could, work on a piece of bread and some coffee just to, get something on your stomach. But after that, you'd head over to the briefing. The CO would come in, they'd pull back the curtain. You'd, anxiously await, where is the curtain where's the ribbon going on the map? Is it going to Berlin? Is it going to be a milk run today? In the briefing, that's where everybody would be at, and they'd talk to you about things like what's the weather going to be like, takeoff time, what do we expect from German opposition, flat guns, just things like that to mentally prepare yourself. But after that, in fairly quick succession, you'd head over to the equipment hut, get your gear, like your electrically heated flying suit, your Mae West life preserver, other equipment, and then they take you over to the what they called the hard stand, where a plane parks, kind of a parking lot. It's called the hard stand. Each plane has its own hard stand. So once you get there, that's where they'd have things like your flak helmet and flak vest. The ground crew would be getting the guns ready, making some final preparations. One story I thought was nice, which I'm sure is the case for just countless guys, is a good friend of mine who's still with us, a guy named Joe Urice, was a tail gunner. Joe's 99, and he said that right after they went and got their equipment, you had a few minutes. So he and a few other guys would head over to the chaplain's hut, and the chaplain always took time to pray with those guys. And as Joe said, I never went in the air without spiritual guidance. So a lot of guys would go see the chaplain. Chaplain Glenn Teska was one of the chaplains at Thorpe Abbotts, would provide that service. And then you'd head over to the plane and have a few minutes to get everything ready. The pilot might talk to the crew chief of the ground crew to say, hey, anything I should be aware of today. That relationship was absolutely vital. And then it's just a matter of getting your ducks in a row inside the plane, getting your gear and equipment in the plane, and awaiting takeoff. I think in some movies it shows, very chummy and chatty and all this stuff, but and there probably were instances of that happening, but probably in the case of a lot of guys, it's just quiet reflection, just, making sure your stuff is in order, because, every little detail counts. All that preparation is important before takeoff time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point, actually. I can't imagine there was a lot of chit chat. It's all you can do is to put one foot in front of the other when you're filled with that much terror.
Would
Yeah.
they fly one mission a day, or would they go ever up again? I mean, what was the protocol for that? Would it just be you picked when you picked, and it could be one a day or none, or was there more than that?
At most, these guys would fly one a day. I think the rare exception might have been, on D-Day, where there were multiple combat missions flown. But given how much time is involved in these, some of these might be 8-hour missions. That's your entire day right there.
Yeah.
And there might be instances where you're flying in multiple days back to back, but or there might be you're flying every other day. Some of it, as the guys will tell you, is just purely the luck of the draw. So I think most of the enlisted men probably had no idea of when they're going to fly, but some of the officers who had been privy to certain briefings might have an idea of what's to come. But a lot of the times you may be in the officers club. They had one of the light system in the officers club too, so as you're in there having a drink, smoking a cigarette, you can see is it green, is it going to be a go tomorrow. But a lot of times you just don't know.
And was a tour, was it based on time or the amount of missions you flew? How did that work for the crews, or did
at the early parts of the war, it was 25 missions. That was something that was well known. And 25 may seem like a small number, but Harry Crosby talks about this a great deal in his book. Of the original crews that went over there, 77% of the original cadre did not hit the 25 mission mark, which is just a staggering figure, either killed or shot down. So if you were one of the lucky few that hit that 25 mission mark early on, I mean, that's just some of it is skill, some of it is preparation, but so much of it is luck. But those numbers greatly improved as the war went on, which is why once the loss rate diminished at two different points in the war, they raised the mission mark to 30 missions, and then at the very end, it became 35 missions before you could.
I have to just interject here because our producer Leighton is a bit of a stickler for certain things and a huge nerd about this particular area of history. He keeps writing the word Toby Jug with a question mark.
I lean down my shoulder so he can see, so you can any 8th Air Force fan may have that in their collection. So if you've seen the movie 12 O'Clock High, that was on the mantle there at the base, whether it's, if it's turned one way, a mission's a go. If it's turned the other way, it's a no-go. But I imagine you might see a few more of these on the market after
Masters. Yeah, so there's some celebrationary stuff going on in the chat window from Leighton. He'd called this. This is very good.
So he can be pleased I had it behind me. Sorry, I can't get everything in the queue there.
You mentioned, just briefly, sorry, Matt, you mentioned a few times now about preparation and how important that was. I mean, were there mistakes? Were there things? I mean, what do you kind of mean by that? Because there's obviously a lot of guns on the plane, and I guess if one of them doesn't work, that's going to probably affect your chances of survival, is it?
Sure, and that's what
I mean, is this what you mean by preparation? Is it making sure, what were the kind of risks? I mean, were there kind of common mistakes or things that went wrong that would account for a high loss rate as well?
I think you've got your air crew preparation and then your ground crew preparation. So the air crews are doing everything from pre-flight checklist to just visual inspection of making sure everything's in order, making sure your gun is mounted in there correctly, making sure everything looks right. Do I have my parachute? All those like little things. Yeah. But I think that's also where the relationship between the air crew and ground crew is vital. And I think, unfortunately, the the ground crews haven't gotten the attention that they've deserved, because these guys cannot fly these missions if the ground crews are not doing what it is that they need to do and making sure the planes are airworthy. But some of it's also the armorers, the ordnance guys, the guys loading the bombs loaded correctly. Has this gun been greased up correctly? Has it been tested out? Has it been cleaned? The relationship with the ground guys was just vital. So there was certainly admiration and respect from the air crews to the ground crews, because those guys would be working while the air crew's sleeping, the ground crew's working. Those guys were out and they had a little tent set up at the hard stand, working overnight, sometimes in a freezing cold weather, to make sure that plane was ready to go, because the last thing they want is for a plane to be have to come back due to mechanical issues, or heaven forbid it goes down over enemy territory because of an engine problem or something that could have been corrected.
Yeah, because these were like I said earlier, these were state-of-the-art machines. I mean, no one had really seen these kind of things before. So, yeah, I guess you would at the time, new technology, things go wrong. Improvements have probably been made to the aircraft all through the war. Is that correct? Would it go through different evolutions or?
That's right. I mentioned they start out with B17, the E model, and they go to an F model, and then later in the war they go to the G model. And just kind of briefly what that's all about is, by the time they went to the G model, those are, if you've seen the B-17s early on, it might have the olive drab paint scheme. Later in the war, it's just the silver aluminum finish, but they also added a chin turret to the front of the plane for extra firepower. They also did things like staggering the gun emplacements in the waist area, actually have plexiglass over the waist windows, just a lot of smaller modifications that took place. They were state-of-the-art planes, but engines are engines. So you've got 4 Wright Cyclone engines on these planes, and a lot of the guys that became crew chiefs had some kind of maintenance or engineering experience before the war. These guys could take engines apart with their eyes closed and put it back together. And just the stories I've heard of what these guys did, like, I mean, one of the guys, Dewey Christopher, who was a crew chief in the 351st, Dewey had to get up in the wing. So literally the only way he could get into a crevice in the wing was like take his clothes off and be greased up to get in there to get to something. But that's how much it meant to him. Like, I'm going to make sure this works no matter what. So just some incredible stories of heroism from the ground crew guys, of what they did to make sure these planes were airworthy every day.
Wow.
Yeah. And so this sounds like a really asinine question, but is Berlin the most dangerous destination?
I think it varies. I don't have the statistics in front of me of what statistically was the most dangerous, but one reason Berlin was certainly feared is as the war progressed, you know, a lot of the German fighter reserves were defending Berlin. So by the time they conducted the first daylight bombing raids at Berlin in March of 44, you're flying through, I think, something like 700 flak guns that are guarding the entire area leading to the target. I think the number was 70% of the German fighter force was in range to be able to intercept. So you're flying through not just German fighters but flak. I mean, it's the one place obviously Hitler wanted defended. They had flak towers in Berlin. It's it's the place that when they pulled back the curtain, guys will tell you they saw the ribbon stretched to Berlin, and they're noticeable groans knowing that like it's not going to be good. No one was ever happy per se when they saw it going to Berlin.
So so that leads me to sort of twin questions now, but they sort of lead on from one another. First of all, once they get to the destination, let's call it Berlin in this case, and they've run this gauntlet of the defense, the fighter pilots, the flak, and everything. How difficult is it to hit the payload properly? This to hit the target, or by this point are they sort of slightly carpet bombing targets?
So I think many are familiar with at least the term of the Norton bomb site, which was considered secret back then. That the bomb site itself, when you weren't on a mission, the components were taken out and locked up because that was secret. So that certainly allowed for a degree of precision bombing. I think the term was thrown around of you could hit a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet. A lot of that is true to an extent, and I think I'm not a expert on the accuracy of bombing, but testing out a Norton bomb site stateside is one thing. Doing it in combat where you have your wingman on fire and you're having to shift position, or you have flak that has hit your plane, there's so many variables that are in play. So on some missions you're getting pretty accurate, you may hit the factory, but on some maybe you're hitting within a mile or two. It greatly varied, but as the war progressed, you were really following the lead of the lead crew. So the lead crew would drop their bombs, and then everybody else would, toggle their bombs in succession.
I think my mum could attest to the accuracy of the American bombing raids because she lived in Stieglitz and their entire street was completely wiped out. And that was a target because there was a lot of railroads would go through Stieglitz and out of Berlin's south and southeast. So
Can I ask you a question then? Did anybody consider putting a pickle barrel at the far end of the street? They would have just gone straight into the pickle barrel. So, and then on this interests me as well. So once the payload's gone, is it sort of easy to get home, or are you just running the same gauntlet in reverse?
In a lot of cases, you're running the same gauntlet in reverse. Or heaven forbid you don't reach the target. There were instances of guys that have realized like, hey, we haven't dropped our bombs yet, but our wing is on fire, we're probably not going to go put this out. Maybe you'll drop your bombs then just to try to save some weight and make it back. But yeah, in a lot of cases you had to fight your way into the target and fight your way out of it, and it was extremely difficult.
Yeah, there's in Norfolk, where we used to go on summer holiday, there's a series of craters that just go through farming fields, and apparently the story was a German bombing raid on Norwich, and before he got to his target, he had to drop the bombs to reduce the weight to make a quick getaway. And so you get there's this like half a dozen or so sort of craters that are still there. You can still see them. Yeah, it's quite cool.
That's interesting. The Germans actually, on one occasion, the Germans did bomb Thorpe Abbotts, and it was probably, I guess, what you call a target of opportunity. But there were some other planes coming in, and they had the runway lights on at night, and then a German bomber had kind of snuck through that and managed to leave a couple craters on the runway, which were quickly replaced. But those things happened.
And in many instances, the crews that were shot down, there were guys that were captured.
That's right. So if you know, there's just so many different stories of guys that became POWs. You know, sadly, some guys, you know, might not survive the impact of making it out of the plane. You know, you did have some horrible situations where you know, you're parachuting out and you may have been shot by the Luftwaffe. That, I don't think that was necessarily the norm, but you know, once you bailed out of the plane, that was like objective one. Objective two was like, am I going to safely reach the ground, and what's going to happen to me after that? So it's interesting as the war progressed, and I think the German populace, you know, were very angry about what's happened, cities being bombed and whatnot. You did see instances of a lot more hostilities towards some of these airmen. So there's some sad situations where, you know, even in the case of the 100th, you had guys that were lynched by the Germans. My friend who's no longer with us, Frank Buschmeyer, parachuted out over Merceburg and landed in a small creek, had his leg bleeding. He was the civilians drug him out and beat him, and he probably would have died were it not for the fact that German military showed up and you know, formally detained them. But that was kind of the start in your POW journey, is getting captured and interrogated at one of the German interrogation centers, and then depending on if you're an enlisted airman or an officer sent to, that would determine, you know, which Stalag POW camp you were sent to. And as the phrase goes, for you, the war is over. That's something that countless airmen heard from the Germans when they were detained.
Were there any instances of escaping?
There were some. The 100th did have a number of guys who actually evaded capture. So, you know, guys were apprised of, you know, might carry a silk map with them to, you know, have an idea of the layout of where they're at. You did have guys that managed to evade, whether it was go back through France and with help from the underground. Guys who landed in Belgium had help from the underground. Some of these guys were actually, you know, hiding out for months on end. A couple of the guys did make it back. During World War II, the policy was that, you know, if you evaded and you come back, you know, that you can't fly any more missions because, you know, you now have knowledge of what the underground looks like. If, you know, if you were captured again, that could get out. But you did have some guys that evaded. And then I think one of the more interesting escape stories is at the very end of the, not to fast forward too much here, but at the end of the war, you know, when the Germans are in their final throes, they start moving the POWs from the Stalag camps because the Russians are approaching. They want to, the POWs are bargaining chips for them at that point. They want to move them back into German territory. So Buck Clevin, as they're doing this forced march through the snow and horrible conditions, Buck Clevin finally has enough, and you know, it seemingly tells John Egan, like, I'm going to make a run for it. And sure enough, Buck actually managed to escape during this forced march at the end of the war, and made it to the American lines and made it back to Thorpe Abbotts at the end. So you did have some interesting situations like that play out.
Wow. Fantastic.
Wow.
I mean, we could talk about this for another 3 hours, but I will sort of round it out now because I can't keep you too long. So at the end of the war, once the hostilities are over, the 100th Bomb Group are involved in humanitarian missions. Well, what did that involve?
It's pretty neat, and this obviously just impacted the guys at the end of the war versus the beginning. But and this is kind of an unknown part of history. In the very final days of World War II, there were still large portions of the Netherlands that were under German occupation, and sadly, at that time, the Dutch people were starving, literally starving. The Germans had cut off food supplies, and you know, in an effort to kind of you know, make nice as negotiations are ongoing, the Germans agreed to a ceasefire to where American and British crews would fly in at low altitude, drop food to the Dutch people. The RAF called it Operation Manna, and the Americans called it Operation Chowhound. But the 100th itself took part in 6 of those flights. And it's interesting, you know, and these other missions, you're flying at 25,000 feet. You're not seeing people from above. And you're dropping bombs at that. So for these guys who had seen war firsthand and, you know, just seen such horrible things occur, had been through so much, to be able to fly a mission where, you know, you're flying in low, you could see the Dutch people waving at you from below, you're dropping food. these guys will tell you like that's their finest hour. Nothing gave them more joy than to do that and see the response from the Dutch people. So for those guys, it was just such a nice way to end their time. But that was one of them, and then a number of 100th crews helped bring French POWs back from German territory as well. So just kind of a nice capstone to their service.
Did any of them take part in the Berlin airlift in 48?
I don't know. You did have some. It's certainly possible. There were, a lot of guys when they had enough points to go home, they did just that. They went home and put their military time behind them. But there were many guys from the 100th that stayed in. So I don't know specifically, but I'm sure that there are guys that participated in some capacity because they stayed in after the war.
Mm.
And after the war, just to round things off completely here, was there there must have been a hell of a bond between these guys flying these small crews and then the larger crews together? Did they stay in contact? Were there reunions, or did everybody just, that's it, I'm just putting my boots in my cupboard and that's it, I don't want to talk about it anymore?
It's neat. It's much like the 101st or other groups. They had early reunions. And it's they actually had some very big reunions where like hundreds of guys would be there. But I think one thing that's neat is I can't say enough nice things about Harry Crosby as the group navigator for the 100th, who had just seen so much during his time. But after the war, Harry had been a phenomenal writer. Harry became the editor of our newsletter for 25 years, and so Harry had a great quote. He said, we've got an important job to do, which is keeping the men together. So Harry use this newsletter to help spread the word and introduce guys who didn't know each other. But they kept the bonds alive. And for so many guys, you might go to a VFW or something like that, but it's different when you're amongst the guys who knew firsthand what it was like to fly combat missions. So it was such a source of healing for so many of these guys. But even still today, it's neat. We still have reunions every other year. We still had veterans at our reunion in May, and we're having another reunion in 2025 that we certainly hope we still have some veterans who are able to join us. But I mean, to see these guys, hugging and shedding tears, it's something special.
And it's great, of course, for the wider family as well, the children of back in the day, I guess the wives of and everything, they can also like share and be a part of this as well.
It is. It's pretty neat. My good friend Mike Faley, who's been a longtime historian with the 100th Bomb Group, he and I interviewed a guy named Jim Johnson. Jim came to his very first reunion in 2015. It was the only reunion he'd ever been to, and so we interviewed Jim and his wife. And his wife had tears in her eyes at the end of this. It was the first time, of all the years that had gone by, it was the first time she'd ever heard any of these stories. So just, it's such a release for some of these guys to, be able to tell their story. And it's been important for their family to hear it. And we're lucky we have so many volunteers that are second generation, third generation that, feel passionately about helping keep the history alive.
Yeah, and I think it will carry on because, as far as I've concerned, what I've learned is this new younger generation that my son is part of are way more passionate than we were as well. So I think it'll carry on and on, which is fantastic.
And the neat thing, I have to put in a plug for our dear friends at Thorpe Abbotts. So the British people, that bond is still so strong today. There's a fantastic museum at Thorpe Abbotts that is run by all volunteers that just have dedicated their lives to preserving the legacy of the 100th. And they've come to our reunions. They have a fantastic operation there. So if you're ever in that part of East Anglia, certainly check out the 100th Bomb Group Museum, because we're blessed by the fact that, if you want to learn more, you have a place you can go. We have displays here in the States, but you can also go back to the base, which isn't the case for a lot of other units. So we're certainly fortunate in that regard.
Fantastic. Matt Mabe, it's been an absolute pleasure. Oh, yes, sorry. Got another plug for us there. That's going to be part of our master's itinerary when we do a tour. So watch out for that next year. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. We've learned a lot. It's been really, really cool. I can't wait for Masters of the Air. I'm sure there'll be a time when you could come on and actually speak about that, but we'll just wait. We'll just wait for the brilliance that is. And it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you guys for everything that you've done to help keep this part of history alive.
Fantastic. And we are fully engaged in doing Masters of the Air stuff next year. We just need the show to come out.
Soon enough.
I'll keep nagging Kirk Sadusky. Well, cheers, mate. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks, guys.
Thanks, buddy. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Well, it's pretty cool.
Wow. Yeah. Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, very erudite man.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the series now. It looks like it's going to do for like the US Air Force, like what Band of Brothers did for the airborne and
Yeah,
military in general. It's just going to bring the whole thing to a younger generation. And it's just, it's almost a shame that it wasn't like the following year after Band of Brothers or something, where you could still, where more of the veterans would be alive. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah, it's always fascinated me, the sort of like nitty gritty, the day to day, the minute to minute stuff of those guys.
It must have been terrifying knowing
Absolutely
you're going to go
terrifying.
and just from the night before. I mean, would you sleep? Could you
Yeah.
sleep?
No, I don't think so.
No. And you're a passenger. I mean, for 9 out of the 10 crew, there's only one. Well, I suppose there's a pilot and a co-pilot, but one guy's flying the plane at any one time. You know, the rest are passengers. It's just like what, you know, you're going to this place. There's nothing you can do about it.
I know.
Interesting. It's like it's almost like climbing a mountain, isn't it? It's like if you climb Everest, once you summited, you're actually only halfway there because you've got to get back down as well, and they have to come back as well. I didn't realize that point that you made. I'd totally forgotten about that. That after you drop your bombs, but not only do you have to come back, and they all know that you're there.
Yeah.
On the way out, they don't know you're coming, or they might be surprised that you're coming. But when you're on the way back, they know you're coming back.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like they're waiting for you, and so it must have been in a way more terrifying coming home.
Yeah. Yeah. That sort of occurred to me when I was writing those questions. I was like, bloody hell, they were only half done when they dropped their payload.
Yeah, crazy.
Crazy. All right, we should wind things up. Let's say thank you to everybody for listening. Let's say thank you to our Patreons or patrons. I never get that right. It's patrons from Patreons, but we thank you anyway. Yes. And we'll be back next week. I think we have
next week the tour in Australia.
No, it's the week after.
Week after, okay.
Yeah. We've got Catherine Wyler next week as well. So it's just getting better and better.
Yeah.
On this particular podcast, and we have Leighton to thank for that, the Bloodhound himself.
Thank you, Leighton.
Thank you, Leighton. He's got some fantastic guests lined up. And we appreciate everything. I appreciate all the people who reached out after the Woody one that we did before last week as well, because people really, really like that. Yeah, it's great. It's great to have these people on. It's great to have their time, and we thank them all for it. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week. Bye, guys.
See ya.